nuestros abuelos imaginaban que era mapa, en su mente tenían toda la imagen, en su imaginación ya conocían. Los chamanes, desde el sueño, desde ayahuasca, ellos manejaban. Ellos no tenían GPS, ya tenían su GPS en su cerebro y conectaba al camino donde tenían que caminar. Es muy importante conocer ese conocimiento ancestral, también conocer las herramientas o la parte técnica de cómo hacer un mapeo, de cómo medir a su territorio.
This is a film about mapping and monitoring on Indigenous peoples' territories. All the interviewees sharing their experiences in this film are Indigenous. They explain what mapping and monitoring are, how mapping and monitoring strengthen communities and help protect territories. They also share some of the challenges that mapping and monitoring may bring and how to reduce or avoid them.
For us, what is important is deeply knowing our territory, the places, the stories, the history, knowing how the different pieces relate to each other. Our connection to our territory is holistic. It's a mutual relationship. This relationship gives us our livelihood, our culture, our spiritual connection. And we in return care for the territory. Through this deep connection, we and the territory are one and the same.
Indigenous peoples have always recorded and shared information about their world, their culture, and their identity. Some ways of doing this have been as objects, others drawings, but many are spoken, sung, or chanted, telling the creation stories, histories, and geographies of each territory.
We never had anything written like in the form of a book, but what we had before was that it's knowledge. Even when our elders never went to universities, they've always had in their mind that whatever we do now impacts the future, and we've always had the intention to secure the future generation.
Maps express opinions. They express the views of the people who make the maps. They show some things and hide others. They tell one story instead of another story. People can use them to persuade others to believe in certain ways of thinking and being. Maps have great power to change minds and create reality. How maps use that power depends on who makes the map.
The first thing I remember when you say maps, I think about colonization. Maps to me is like treasure hunting, to find more treasure, to get more riches.
In colonial times, empires used maps to cut up the land, claiming vast areas of the world.
From the history we hear from the elders, the colonialists came in and they made a map, but unfortunately it was a dispossession tool, since they even renamed the names, like the original naming of the community. The colonialists also used a map to take away the resources of the community, so it was used to infringe the rights of the community.
When countries became independent from the colonial powers, governments often continued to use maps to assert their control over large parts of their country.
In our places, maps have been made by wealthy, powerful people and have been used to restrict our access, to evict us, to give away our lands to business developers. Even now, maps are still used to create boundaries that break apart our lands and tear our people from their roots.
As a people, we use those lands. Those are our lands from way back. We knew the area before. We use natural boundaries, for example, rivers, large rivers, mountain range. We know all the names of mountains. We know all the names of the creeks. We know all the old settlements. We know all the areas that we use for hunting and fishing. And as long as we put it on a map, then we have a stronger evidence-based information to provide for our recognition of the territory as a whole.
In recent times, indigenous peoples have been taking back control, becoming the map makers of their own territories, like the Loira Maasai in Tanzania.
Now, we ourselves have mapped our own territory. We held many community meetings and had a detailed interview with many elders. They took us to the sacred sites. We included hundreds of place names with stories and history connected to each. Sacred sites, water sources, traditional human and livestock trails. We mapped land uses, the homes of wildlife, existing and proposed external development such as mining, and so much more. When government saw the detailed knowledge that we have of our land, they were surprised. This helped very much in securing our territory. Our territory has borders with several other communities who also share resources with us. When we made our map, it was very important that our neighbors didn't feel that we were creating hard boundaries. This could cause conflict, so we made sure that we spoke to all of our neighbors first, so they would understand what we were doing.
Indigenous peoples use their maps to assert their rights over their ancestral lands and to help them make community decisions around land use. One example comes from the Shawi people in Peru, who recently created a new map of their territory.
¿Vamos a dar validez que sea este mapa firme para nosotros? ¡Sí! ¡Fuerte palmas, hermanos!
Mi nombre es Luis Payaba Pacaya, especialista en sistemas geográfica. En esta oportunidad estoy apoyando a editar y realizar el mapa histórico-cultural del pueblo Shawi.
Los cerros son estos cerros. De repente tienen cataratas, de repente tienen por ahí un lugar sagrado, una cueva, todo eso también hay que rellenar.
El mapa está elaborado con todos los ancianos, los sabios, ¿no? Para que los jóvenes no pierdan esa costumbre, esa generación y sepan qué importante es el territorio para ellos. Y así mantener la cultura a las nuevas generaciones. Yo creo que la iniciativa acá del pueblo Shawi es muy importante y así poderles también incentivar a los demás pueblos que ellos también realicen su mapa histórico para que puedan defender bien y saber de su cultura, de dónde vienen ellos, ¿no?
Throughout time, indigenous people have managed and monitored their territory, checking how it is changing over time. This way, they maintain balance and harmony. In each place, they developed rich cultural weaves of knowledge and practices, words, stories and ceremonies, observed the behaviors of the animals, the life cycles of the plants, the seasonal changes, the impacts of human activity, and unexpected changes in the territory.
Many of our women in our community can tell the names and uses of well over 1,000 species of plants alone. Because we have this deep relationship built over many generations, we are able to observe, notice changes, and take the right action to protect. In more recent times, a new word has been brought to us that describes how we measure changes in our territory. This is now called monitoring our territory. Of course, we have always done this, but we now have a new outside knowledge and tools to help.
Indigenous peoples have many methods and ways of monitoring their lands. But what does the term monitoring mean in an indigenous context today?
El monitoreo es un proceso continuo por la cual se verifica lo que está pasando en nuestro territorio. Es una forma de ver cómo está cambiando nuestro territorio y de acuerdo a eso podemos planificar para una mejor gestión de nuestro territorio.
In the same way that mapping is sometimes taken over by external people, so too is the process of monitoring indigenous territories. In many places, governments, NGOs, and private corporations still take control of conserving and monitoring territories. In some cases, this is done without involving the indigenous peoples themselves or only using them as guides or data collectors. This means excluding those with the deepest connections to their territories who have been monitoring for generations. When monitoring is designed and led by external agencies with no indigenous involvement, the results often only reflect external priorities and not those of the local community.
We also had to make sure that we, the local people, and our traditional knowledge are treated as equal partners. We don't want to be only the data collectors. We want to be the one at the heart of the process.
Communities need to collectively plan what they want to get out of mapping and monitoring right from the start. These priorities will determine what they choose to focus on. It could be on certain geographical areas, natural resources or biodiversity, or the focus may be more on cultural practices or customary knowledge.
We believe that if we as the people start focusing more on doing our own thing, it would benefit us rather than to have someone from outside or someone from not within the territory come do it for us. They just do it for the money sometimes. They just maybe do it because it's a job they have. But for us, it's very important because it's part of our daily life. This is our lands.
Indigenous peoples are taking back leadership and control of both mapping and monitoring on their territories. This is necessary as they hold collective rights over these territories, and controlling these processes contributes to securing the recognition of these rights. The Achuar Ecuador have a dedicated team who oversee the mapping and monitoring of their territory.
El equipo se llama Amazán. El equipo Amazán va a monitorear todo el territorio para verificar si hay amenazas exteriores o amenazas comunitarias. Vamos a caminar línea recta unos 2 kilómetros. Vamos a explicarles por qué se está cogiendo los puntos, se está monitoreando. Entonces, vamos a caminar. ¿Listos? Tenemos que verificar y conocer la realidad que existe en nuestro territorio. Cada semana estamos caminando en todo el territorio. Verificamos las huellas, verificamos los senderos, verificamos los árboles, verificamos las huertas, verificamos todas las cosas que existen en nuestra zona. Así es que cogemos puntos de GPS, ingresamos a ArcGIS para conocer cuántos árboles de ceibo tenemos. La persona que va a tumbar y usar el material para la construcción también debe comunicar al presidente y al equipo de monitores para coger el punto, y también tiene que reforestar 10 plantas de ese árbol. Hay que apropiarnos de donde venimos, que toda esta actividad debe salir desde el territorio, no desde arriba. Conjuntamente con la comunidad, con la decisión del pueblo, se hacen estas actividades.
These days, many communities, even in very remote areas, have internet and satellite coverage. This makes it possible for them to make use of digital tools such as GPS, cameras, drones, and mobile phones like the Ogiek people in Kenya.
sangdap tegandet komi olo mwengoshek olo ko kumnyaret alafu komi olo keremeche sokbeko komi olo kebute ngwek sikenget kekoru soru sikiriboki sasa yo kakinget sasa olo raich nebelek makekes la keribo kila ne simakwa biko chutyo kiinterfere ako olo ibur nebele ambu kiekyan yo kieimuche ngerekyi mbioro ko sasa kama yoche kese sasa kieke mapan cheke sasa le ndiko tekisao bit tekemiranye sao bit.
There are many benefits to both mapping and monitoring. Both help communities to gather and analyze information about their territories. As such, they are key tools for planning and community decision-making to show what used to be in the territory and what has changed. They also help to pass ancestral knowledge on to the youth. Often the most important uses of mapping and monitoring are to help defend indigenous territories from outside interests, as shown by the Tupelo Talam in Indonesia.
Legal logging yang di operatornya itu orang dari luar komunitas adat. Mereka masuk ke sini terus ambil kayu milik masyarakat. Masyarakat sendiri sebenarnya bersepakat bahwa untuk melindungi wilayah ini mereka harus melakukan pemetaan partisipatif. Pemetaan ini menjadi hal penting bagi masyarakat sebagai yang pertama sebagai basis klaim komunitas bahwa inilah wilayah adat Tupelo dalam Dudaga. Peta-peta mental itu sudah ada, cuman bagaimana membuktikan secara visual kepada orang lain bahwa inilah wilayah kami. Pemetaan sudah ada, peta sudah ada, tapi untuk memperkuat dan juga mengamankan wilayah ini, kelembagaan itu harus dihidupkan kembali. Sendiri yang kerja. Banyak hal yang bisa masyarakat buat dengan peta itu untuk melindungi wilayah, untuk mengelola pengelolaan, untuk pengembangan ekonominya. Jadi berbagai hal bisa dilakukan ketika pemetaan partisipatif ini dilakukan oleh komunitas Tupelo dalam Dudaga.
Although there can be many benefits from community-run mapping and monitoring, there can also be challenges. So it is important that each Indigenous people, each community thinks about their own best practices for mapping and monitoring their territories.
The technical knowledge tends to be more easily accepted by the authorities and businesses, but it can also reduce our complex relationship between human and nature to numbers and to tick in boxes. We wanted to make sure that the technical approaches and the traditional approaches will complement each other. It was very important for us that our cultural and spiritual knowledge, our ancestral ways of knowing the territory, will be central and not to be sidelined.
El mapeo es una herramienta para la gestión y defensa del territorio, pero también como herramienta puede ser de doble filo porque muchos pueden usar ese mapeo para identificar zonas donde hay recursos.
We need to know who we can trust because when we look back at history, our own people sometimes have sold us out or shared information they shouldn't have done.
We need to make sure our information is stored carefully and doesn't get into the hands of wrong people. That's why we carefully decided first how the information could and could not be shared.
Mapping is challenging, difficult. It's a tedious process because it's involvement of the community. And for us, there is no use to be doing map if the community who actually owns the land, who knows the area, are not involved.
Es muy importante la participación de todos los comuneros, especialmente en los visionarios, los conocedores y las mujeres y jóvenes y niños.
In some places, the monitoring by communities threatens destructive development in a territory. When this happens, it is important that the people involved in the community monitoring are protected and safe.
Monitors are also sometimes threatened because the miners or the illegal people think that they're being reported by the monitors. So sometimes people are threatened. However, we see it as important to us, because if we don't do it, no one will do it for us. So for us, it's important to really carry on if we want to see our forest standing, if we want to see a bright future for the younger ones coming up.
For us, the map is equal to the deep knowledge and understanding that we cultivate towards our territory. And monitoring is the relationship between us and the territory. Taking time, visiting, observing, connecting, and relating to the place. These two are interconnected. The more we relate to the territory, the better we can protect it.
If you are mapping and monitoring your territory, remember that Indigenous peoples have been mapping and monitoring for centuries, each in their own unique ways, using their own ancestral approaches. Today, we can also use new knowledge and tools to help us do this. Look into the plans for your community and check that they are designed and owned by your people. Check that the process remains deeply rooted in your ancestral knowledge and practices. Check that it helps you to defend your rights and territory from land grabs and exploitation. Check that your map expresses your vision of development. In this way, it will bring many benefits to your people and your territory.